as you know, there's a level to which you can't instruct people at the AA, unfortunately. Okay, welcome. And it's more than just an ordinary welcome to welcome Charles Rice, who's going to speak here. Charles did his kind of MA, as I recall it, at the London Consortium, but had already concentrated on the domestic interior and produced a very kind of novel and interesting thesis on the domestic interior, essentially, of the 19th century. And then returned to Australia, where he developed that into a thesis, whose work finally is to be found here in a work which I got halfway through over the weekend, The Emergence of the Interior, which is a handsomely produced book by Routledge. And Charles was always someone who was concerned with integrating a knowledge of architecture, including the architecture of the 19th century house. Let's say where you kind of at least start from the sort of Robin Evans position, but where he had the power to analyze the objects which exist within the house and the house itself as part of a kind of overall effect. And there seemed to me the strength in the MA thesis. He obviously continued it through the PhD thesis, and it's here in the book as a kind of reflection on architecture and domesticity, you know, to be taken kind of as a whole in its relation to modernity. Charles has been here several times to lecture, and as I recall, when he was here, taught in the diploma school on the city and Benjamin. And partly this is like a somewhat Benjaminian kind of account of the interior. So it's with great pleasure that we welcome Charles. It's always kind of incredibly nice to see him, and we look forward to his talk this evening. Charles Rice.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's indeed a great pleasure and an honour to be invited to speak here. I was recalling that it's been about 10 years since I've had a kind of relationship with the AA, and it's in that time that my thinking, I think, has been decisively formed by being in this building, whether it be the conversations with Mark that I recall so fondly over those years, or actually the building itself, and in some ways the traces of its domestic life that I think still echo through the way it is to inhabit this building. So I'll just have a little sip of water before we begin. So to begin, In 1862, Charles Baudelaire wrote a prose poem entitled The Twofold Room. It begins with a description of a room just like a daydream. He writes, "The furniture takes on elongated shapes, prostate and languorous. Each piece seems to be dreaming as if living in a state of trance, like vegetable and mineral things. The draperies speak an unvoiced language, like flowers and skies and setting suns." The description of this animate, nature-like room changes abruptly halfway through the poem. An intrusion comes with a terrible, heavy thump on the door, at which point Baudelaire remembers, "Yes, this hovel, this home of everlasting boredom, is indeed my own. Look, there are the fatuous bits of junk, my dusty and chipped furniture, the fireless hearth with not even a glowing ember in a grate all fouled with spit, the dingy windows down which the rain has scrawled runnels in the grime, the manuscripts riddled with cross-outs or left half done, the calendar on which the evil days of reckoning are underlined in pencil." A context for immaterial, irreal experience, Baudelaire's interior is also the context for his work, for his relation to the productive cycle. It figures at once his removal from the world and his belonging to it. It is an interior in which time is suspended in reverie, as well as one which registers the reality of the inexorable march of time. These poetic reflections might be compared to thoughts he recorded a year later in The Painter of Modern Life. The artist bears witness to modernity as a condition caught between the internal and the fleeting. The Twofold Room is emblematic of an event I wish to discuss this evening: the emergence of the domestic interior as both a concept and material manifestation of the 19th century. The poem captures the sense of the emergent interior's doubleness, a sense which involves the reality of the interior's spatiality, in this instance Baudelaire's own hovel, a condition marked out in contrast to a bourgeois respectability, as well as its condition as image, one that can be imagined and dreamed. This sense of doubleness is identifiable in a semantic shift which marks the interior's emergence. The OED traces the usage of the word interior to somewhere in the late 14th century, but it meant simply inside as divided from outside. It was only from the beginning of the 19th century, however, that the interior came to mean what is recorded as the inside of a building or room, especially in reference to its artistic effect. Also, a picture or representation of the inside of a building or room. Also, in theatre, a set consisting of the inside of a building or room. The same semantic shift is traceable for the French intérieur, which also enters usage in the German language from the beginning of the 19th century. French architects Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine, in their publication The Recueil de Décoration Intérieure of 1801, is one of the first usages of the term in this new sense. They recognised what might be called the separability of the interior from the inside space of architecture. And English architect Thomas Hope's 1807 portfolio, entitled Household Furniture and Interior Decoration, evidences a similar situation. The interior thus emerged with significance as a physical three-dimensional space, as well as an image, whether it be a two-dimensional representation, such as a painting, a print in a portfolio of decoration, or a flat backdrop that could conjure up an interior as a theatrical scene. The image-based sense also encompasses a reverie or imaginal picture like Baudelaire's, one which could transform an existing spatial interior into something other. This doubleness of the interior involves the interdependence between image and space, with neither sense being primary. In this way, the interior emerged as a new topos of subjective interiority and framed newly articulated and increasingly widespread desires for privacy and comfort, for the consolidation of gendered and familial roles in life, for the linking of a consumer culture to the attainment of domestic arrangements that demonstrated acceptable norms, and for practices of self-representation in the context of domestic life. considering the interior as a historically emergent phenomenon does not mean that furniture and its arrangement, or indeed domestic habits and mores, did not exist before this time. Rather, the interior conceptualized a particular emerging and developing consciousness of and comportment to the material realities of domesticity. Realities which were actively formed in this emergence and which, as in Baudelaire's Reverie, could also become transformed and destabilized through it. Now, considering the interior in this way disturbs a conventional account of the interior's history, one which sees it as essential and timeless, ways of living in times past contributing to the story of how we live today. This sort of history is often presented through images at a gallop, beginning at the earliest moment in Western art, then focusing on periods and places thought to be most significant. Renaissance Italy, 17th century Holland, and then 19th century France, England, and Germany. The difference between artistic genres, social and temporal and geographical contexts, and indeed different and changing ways for understanding the world, are all subsumed under a narrative of what Michel Foucault calls recognition and rediscovery of ourselves in the undifferentiated events of the past. This is a historical project which assumes a transparency between visual representations of the interior and the material realities of spaces and the conditions of their occupation. The sociological version of this project has tended to work within a model which privileges what anthropologist Daniel Miller refers to as the inherent empathy between researcher and subject of research. Similarly, the literature on the psychology of home privileges this sense of identity at the level of symbolic interpretations of objects and their environments. In these paradigms, the interior is stable and always pre-existent as a concept, or rather, it lacks conceptualization, seeing as we all supposedly know what it is. Studies of the interior and domesticity framed in this way suffer from recognition, from the seeming inescapability of a personal association between researcher and subject of research. In coming to grips with the interior as a historically emergent phenomenon, there is a more unsettling account to be given, an account where the interior, in its doubleness, continually escapes attempts to stabilise it within essentialist historical, social and psychological frames of reference. Yet, as I hope to demonstrate, the interior emerged together with forces of normalisation that have provided the ground for being able to consider the interior as the recognisable context for domestic life. The generalisation of such norms across history and experience attests not to the essential truth of these associations as the very normalising influence of the domestic, in which the emergence of the interior has played a crucial role. In the Arcades project, the voluminous, unfinished and perhaps unfinishable history of the 19th century, written through the 20s and 30s, Walter Benjamin grasped this issue as the predicament of studying the 19th century as the recent but also archaic past. He writes, "The difficulty in reflecting on dwelling. On the one hand, there is something age-old, perhaps eternal, to be recognised here, the image of that abode of the human being in the maternal womb. On the other hand, and this motive of primal history notwithstanding, we must understand dwelling in its most extreme form as a condition of 19th century existence." One of Benjamin's tasks in the Arcades project was to trace out this extreme form of dwelling through the emergence of the interior within bourgeois culture. He reveals a crucial link between the significance of the interior and the emerging problematic of experience in the context of modernity. This problematic is linked to the way in which a modern account of the subject was formalised in the science and therapeutics of Freudian psychoanalysis. And it is this link that I shall try to explain in this lecture. Now, as I proceed, I'm keen to avoid the simple illustrative function of the image. because this is an issue which lies at the very heart of the problem with conventional illustrated histories of the interior. However, in deference to you as a kind of dreaming collective, I will leave this slide for you to ponder as I embark upon an analysis of Walter Benjamin's writings on the interior. So in his short expose or synopsis of the Arcades project, Benjamin writes, "Ever since the time of Louis Philippe, the bourgeois has shown a tendency to compensate for the absence of any trace of private life in the city. He tries to do this within the four walls of his apartment. It is as if he made it a point of honour not to allow the traces of his everyday objects and accessories to get lost. Indefatigably, he takes the impression of a host of objects. For his slippers and his watches, his blankets and his umbrellas, he devises coverlets and cases. He has a marked preference for velour and plush, which preserve the imprint of all contact. In the style characteristic of the Second Empire, the apartment becomes a sort of cockpit. The traces of its inhabitant are moulded in the interior. Here is the origin of the detective story, which inquires into these traces and follows these tracks. The interior is produced through an infolding, which Benjamin considers literally in terms of the interior as a soft, impressionable surface. This surface does not produce a hermetic seal against the external world, but rather is activated through the inhabitant's relation to the city and its world of publicness, business, and commerce. It enables an explicitly male subjectivity and social identity marked bourgeois to be supported artifactually. The impressionable surface holds on to the artifacts liberated from the world of commodities and interiorized for the securing of a private life. The surface folds to encase the inhabitant and these collected objects. The indefatigable collector understands that such a fabrication of the interior is a continual process, a set of techniques and practices that ensure the ongoing viability of a self. Yet traces registered on the interior's impressionable surface also position the inhabiting subject in a constricting sense. Such traces imply detection, and the detective inevitably begins an investigation at the discovery of a dead body. The larger framing condition here is that for the bourgeoisie at this time, dwelling became divided from work, and in this division, the conditions for the consolidation of the interior in bourgeois life were made possible. What is significant is not the sociological truth of this assertion, but the way in which, in Benjamin's thinking, this division was allied to a problematization in modernity of the philosophical conception of experience. Long experience, or Erfahrung in German, founded on an appeal and a connection to tradition and the accumulation of wisdom over time, comes into conflict with the multitude of momentary, instantaneous experiences, or Erlebnisse, that contribute to the dynamic energy of the modern city. The city alienates long experience, its refuge, and the context for both its loss and its amplification is the domestic interior. Benjamin captured this problematization in his 1936 essay entitled Experience and Poverty. He writes, "Everyone knew precisely what experience was. Older people had always passed it on to younger ones. It was handed down in short form to sons and grandsons with the authority of age, in proverbs, with an often long-winded eloquence as tales, sometimes as stories from foreign lands at the fireside. Where has it all gone?" The interior's emergence became important in relation to the idea that long experience might somehow be wrested from objects, that what was carried in the immateriality of the proverb might, under certain conditions, be provided in a material substitute, that the hearth and its mantelpiece might materially encode the mythical fireside and the situation it provided for the telling of stories. In this way, fabricating and thereby inhabiting an interior was an active, ongoing process, one manifested in Benjamin's account through the male figure of the collector. The collector was not someone who was simply sealed away in the interior, Rather, this figure negotiated the problematic of experience, realizing that its long and momentary forms were ultimately two sides of the same coin. The challenge faced by the collector as Benjamin's true resident of the interior was to bestow, quote, a connoisseur's value rather than a use value on objects, thereby to delight in evoking a world in which, to be sure, human beings are no better provided with what they need than in the real world, but in which things are freed from the drudgery of being useful. This drudgery associated with things was consequent upon the rise of commodity exchange through the 19th century. One of its effects was to produce a strange confusion between the natural and the artificial, the object and the subject. As Marx wrote, quote, the social character of men's labour appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labour, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labour is presented to them as a social relation, existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labour. The domestic interior offered the site where the social life of things could be domesticated in a way that was thought to provide compensation for their stripping of qualities away from bourgeois subjects. Objects as commodities could be wrenched from circulation, freed from the drudgery of being useful, becoming embedded in the interior to produce a new nature of domesticity, one that offered an illusion that long experience could be maintained in the interior. Susan Stewart has located the collection as the final stage of alienation, where the labour of production completed its transmutation into a labour of consumption. She writes, what is the proper labour of the consumer? It is a labour of total magic, a fantastic labour which operates through the manipulation of abstraction rather than through concrete or material means. The interior is the context that allows the collector to capture the commodity and to become entwined with it. The collection is not constructed by its elements, rather it comes to exist by means of its principle of organisation. Through this organisation, one refers to the collection as finished, the subjectivity constructed through it, looking back retrospectively at the narrative of the self built through and into the collection's organisation. This narrative replaces a narrative of history. In its classifications, the collection is ahistorical. Now, while this provides a strong argument for the subject's motivation to collect, collection refashions an alienated self through alienation's final mechanism. This claim for the ahistorical nature of the collection produces a linear concept of the collection's serial acquisition, a history that is the biography of the collector. Yet the possibility of a collapse in the structural integrity of the collection, or an opening beyond its supposed structure, reveals the shortcomings in such a linear concept of acquisition. It produces a slippage in the integrity of the collection, and thus in the collector's subjectivity. Recognising this possibility, Stewart recounts the story of a rare book collector who discovered that there existed another copy of a book he possessed and thought to be unique. The man purchased this other copy from its owner at an extraordinary price and promptly destroyed it. This was not an acquisition per se, but an action that attempted to repair the organising principle of the collection, in this case uniqueness, and thus retrospectively make sense of an earlier acquisition. Benjamin's own thoughts on the collection become significant at this point. He was concerned with what he called the productive disorder of the collection and the way in which it veers between completeness and openness. He writes of the spectacle of things in dispersion and draws a relation between the collector as one concerned with bringing things together in an order and the allegorist who delights in the disorder of things torn out of their context. He writes, in every collector hides an allegorist, and in every allegorist a collector. As far as the collector is concerned, his collection is never complete, for let him find just a single piece missing, and everything he's collected remains a patchwork, which is what things are for allegory from the beginning. For this ambivalent figure of the collector, the spectacle of things in their dispersion produces a particular sense of perception, one Benjamin developed in relation to Henri Bergson's link between perception and time. Benjamin writes, "This is the way things are for the great collector. They strike him. How he himself pursues and encounters them, what changes in the ensemble of items are affected by a newly supervening item. All this shows him his affairs in a constant flux." The link between commodity striking the collector and the tenor of momentary experience is clear. Benjamin also saw a link between the process of collecting and a certain sort of memory. He writes, "A sort of productive disorder is the canon of the mémoire involontaire, as it is the canon of the collector. The mémoire volontaire, on the other hand, is a registry providing the object with a classificatory number behind which it disappears. So now we've been there. I've had an experience." Now, Benjamin's concern is for the collector who is open at some level to a productive disorder, one that always lurks at the heart of a classificatory system. Here, the concept of the trace becomes crucial, and Benjamin used it to link collection to the unconscious memory, or mémoire involontaire. The trace involves not what is manifest at the level of the contents of the collection, or their disappearance behind the classificatory system. Rather, to use a decorating metaphor, it involves what those contents paper over. What caught Benjamin's attention more than the objects collected within the interior were the cases made for objects. He writes, "What didn't the 19th century invent some sort of case for? Pocket watches, slippers, egg cups, thermometers, playing cards. And in lieu of cases, there were jackets, carpets, wrappers, and covers." And here one needs to be reminded of the more insidious sense in which the trace works. In his quasi-autobiographical work, One Way Street, Benjamin writes of the fate of the inhabiting subject positioned by traces. The bourgeois interior of the 1860s to the 1890s, with its gigantic chests distended with carvings, the sunless corners where palms stand, the balcony embattled behind its balustrade, and the long corridors with their singing gas flames fittingly house only the corpse. On this sofa, the aunt cannot but be murdered. The soulless luxuriance of the furnishings becomes true comfort only in the presence of a dead body. This character of the bourgeois apartment, tremulously waiting the nameless murderer like a lascivious old lady her gallant, has been penetrated by a number of authors who, as writers of detective stories, and perhaps also in their works part of the bourgeois pandemonium is exhibited, have been denied the reputation they deserve. The traces that the inhabitant leaves to construct a bourgeois identity open this newly mortified subject to detection. Beyond the specificity of the detective genre, the trace of individual subjectivity secured in private life emerged along with the trace of bourgeois identity measured in social governance. The trace's indexical quality and separability from its referent, the individual body, became linked with the ability to track illegal and deviant behaviour. Another way of stating these relations is to suggest that the trace became significant at the moment anonymity became prevalent in the metropolis. In this setting, it is important to consider closely Benjamin's formulation via Marcel Proust of involuntary memory, or the mémoire involontaire. He writes, "This concept bears the traces of the situation that engendered it. It is part of the inventory of the individual who is isolated in various ways." Benjamin continues, "This means that only what has not been experienced explicitly and consciously, what has not happened to the subject as an isolated experience, can become a component of the mémoire involontaire." The collection, when it opens out beyond the ordered system to the patchwork, opens to the province of this involuntary memory. The interior then works not as the space ensuring the coherence of classification, but as the space for the registering of traces, providing the surface against which the qualities of specific objects which constantly have the potential to open the collection beyond conscious orderliness, might be preserved. It is the unconscious potentiality of this involuntary memory which then opens to the possibility of long experience. Here again is Benjamin's reading of Proust. Proust's work may be regarded as an attempt to produce experience, as Bergson imagines it, in a synthetic way under today's social conditions, for there is less and less hope that it will come into being in a natural way. Proust tells us that for many years he had an indistinct memory of the town of Cambrai, where he had spent part of his childhood. One afternoon, the taste of a kind of pastry called a madeleine, which he later mentions often, transported him back to the past, whereas before he had been limited to the promptings of a memory which more or less obeyed the call of conscious attention. The madeleine was the object whose trace was registered for this involuntary memory, that memory which is opened in the bypassing of the call of conscious attention, and which links to the possibility of long experience, as far as this is possible under today's social conditions. The collection is an attempt, one always related to a perilous dispersion of objects, to find the madeleine, or rather the experience and the memory it might engender. And this is what you'll find happens when you look at images for too long. We shall return to Benjamin and Proust a little bit later, but let us shift at this juncture to the psychoanalytical account of the subject as a way of pursuing further these themes of objects and experience, and to come to terms with the interior's presence in the key formulation of subjectivity in modernity. Gilles Deleuze has written, "Having a room of one's own is a desire, but also a control." With the historical emergence of the interior, desire and control appear as two sides of the same coin. Desiring an interior means submitting to its mechanisms of control. In the late 19th century, desire was theorised psychoanalytically in relation to the controlling mechanism of the domestic interior. In this way, psychoanalysis can be seen to have developed as a technology of subjectification, which can be understood via Nicholas Rose as, quote, the machinations, the being assembled together with particular intellectual and practical instruments, components, entities and devices that produce certain ways of being human, that territorialise, stratify, fix, organise and render durable particular relations that humans may truthfully establish with themselves. The interior can be considered as a practical instrument or machine working as part of the technology of subjectification that psychoanalysis enacted. Within this technology, the interior territorialised particular relations to the self, which were accorded the status of truth. In other words, an explicit relation between the interior and interiority was enacted. There was no essential relation between them. Rather, both were assembled together. The working of this technology is akin to what Foucault has referred to as psychoanalysis's deployment of sexuality within the family. This deployment was not simply focused on the family as defined by the conjugal couple and their children. Rather, it worked through spatial articulations. Foucault writes of spaces haunted by sexuality, spatial conditions created to produce, regulate, separate, and link multiple sexualities. He writes, the separation of grown-ups and children, the polarity established between the parents' bedroom and that of the children, became routine in the course of the 19th century when working-class housing construction was undertaken. The relative segregation of boys and girls, the strict instructions as to the care of nursing infants, maternal breastfeeding, hygiene, the attention focused on infantile sexuality, the supposed dangers of masturbation, the importance attached to puberty, the methods of surveillance suggested to parents, the exhortations, secrets and fears, the presence, both valued and feared, of servants. All this made the family, even when brought down to the smallest dimensions, a complicated network saturated with multiple, fragmentary, and mobile sexualities. Psychoanalysis in this way is not simply reducible to the family drama, but must be considered in relation to a spatialization of its power and effects. One way to consider this spatialization is to look at the context in which the science and therapeutics of psychoanalysis took shape. We might then proceed to Berggasse 19 in Vienna, where from 1908 Sigmund Freud's consulting rooms were contiguous with the Freud family apartment. Now, there is a certain amount of trepidation in taking this course, and it is one to do with the visual evidence provided by photographs. These photographs were taken by Edmund Engelmann in 1938, just prior to the dissolution of these rooms and Freud's flight to London. What I don't wish to suggest is that these photographs provide some sort of objective proof of the domestic scene of psychoanalysis. What they might be able to open, however, is a line of thinking about the doubleness of the interior, its simultaneous existence and signification as both image and space. Domestic spaces by circumstance, Freud's rooms were made into interiors through the arrangement of Freud's vast collection of antique sculpture and imagery. The collection was housed in vitrines and arrayed on every available flat surface. Diana Fuss has noted that, quote, Engelmann's photographs dramatically capture what a half-century of Freud commentary has overlooked, the location of the analytic scene within the four walls of a crypt. When patients arrived at Freud's office, they entered an overdetermined space of loss and absence, grief and memory, elegy and mourning. In short, they entered the exteriorized theatre of Freud's own emotional history, where every object newly found memorialized a love object lost. This exteriorized theatre was the spatialization of Freud's own psychological interiority. Patients undergoing analysis were caught up in this theatre, or in this interior, which set the scene for the exteriorization of their own psychological interiority. The interior was thus not simply a passive context for analysis. It actively participated in analyses and became implicated in the discourse of psychoanalysis that produced through Freud's own practice. Diana Fuss herself has analysed how patients having their first consultation with Freud would be interviewed in the study, the scene of his writing. They were seated in front of a table adjacent to Freud's writing desk, a position at the very centre of the study and its collected objects. A small mirror positioned in the plane of the window adjacent to Freud's desk would reflect the patient, effectively severing the head and making a bust of the patient. In assuming his position at his desk, Freud's own head would then come between the patient and the mirror, and he would assume what Fuss has referred to as the clinical function of the mirror, setting in train the dynamic of transference. Subsequent sessions between Freud and his patients would take place in the consulting room proper. This was joined to the study through double doors which were always kept open. The patient would lie on the couch positioned against a wall, with Freud seated in an armchair next to the head end of the couch. Freud would look out into the room as the reclining patient looked along the line of the couch towards another vitrine of objects positioned against the wall. From a spatiality of seeing, where the patient was the centre of a gaze directed at him by Freud and his objects, and where the patient also becomes a kind of object, the analysis proceeded in the consulting room through a spatiality of listening, where Freud's ear became the sense organ most acutely attuned to the analytical situation. Freud's spatial positioning produced a passive listening technique that corresponded to the practice of free association that Freud encouraged in his patients. The process of free association took place within this interiorized world of antiquities. Yet Freud himself remarked on the role of the space of analysis in a way that denied the overburdened atmosphere of his own consulting rooms. In his text, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, Freud writes, "At least once in the course of every analysis, a moment comes when the patient obstinately maintains that just now positively nothing whatsoever comes to mind. His free associations come to a stop, and the usual incentives for putting them in motion again fail in their effect. If the analyst insists, the patient is at last induced to admit that he is thinking of the view from the consulting room window, or of the wallpaper that he sees before him, or of the gas lamp hanging from the ceiling. Then one knows at once that he has gone off into the transference and that he is engaged upon what are still unconscious thoughts relating to the physician. And one sees the stoppage of the associations disappear as soon as he has been given this explanation. When it is brought to the patient's attention that they are associating with the interior without really knowing it, transference is set in train. In considering Freud's interior as the exteriorized theatre of Freud's own emotional history, transference takes on a spatial dimension, and more than mere wallpaper and gas lamps are at stake. The collection and its relation to antiquity and archaeology becomes constitutive of the scene of transference. That Freud does not remark upon, or may actively have dissembled, the particularity of what one of his own patients would have seen when looking around his consulting room, relates to an ambivalence about what the collection's contents and formation reveal of his psychoanalytical method. Numerous analogies have been made between psychoanalysis and archaeology. But Freud himself seems not to have made the connection between his psychoanalytical method and his own collection of antiquities. Kenneth Reinhard has given the most productively critical account of the archaeological metaphor in psychoanalysis. He argues that it is not simply a therapeutic process of plumbing the subject's unconscious depths and bringing repressed material to the conscious surface, as might an archaeological dig, the recovered objects of which become collector's items. Rather, the archaeological metaphor relates to a lost cause, the inability to recover hidden meanings. A concept of construction is at work in the collection, which produces a particular sense of meaning. Meaning is not simply recovered, but is rather the result of a complex temporal transcoding. In analysing an early use of the metaphor of archaeology in Freud's writing on hysteria, Reinhard argues that the scattered remains uncovered must be filled out and translated before they become meaningful. Moreover, the monuments that are unearthed are not so much of the past as to the past, built by lost civilizations to commemorate their own passing. That is, the monument that was originally intended to immortalise its historical moment in stone disintegrates into relics or fossils which mutely record the inexorable passage of time. If the relics of antiquity speak to the analytic reader, they always speak of something other than the moment they were intended to represent, and always in the foreign and stony tongue of untimely epitaphs. This sense of the untimely epitaph relates to symptomatic elements in cases of hysteria which remain exterior to the processes of symbolic conversion. These so-called stigmata are elements which cannot be subsumed within the archaeological metaphor. They are both prior to and in excess of psychoanalysis treatment, but they are those things which mark the hysteric and thus instantiate treatment. Neither simply foreign to hysteria nor fully within it, the stigmata are, in Lacan's expression, extimate, intimately exterior to both the theory and the phenomenology of the symptom. This sense of the extimate pervades the interiorized scene of Freud's consulting rooms. His own antiquities revealed objectively within an environment that attempts to domesticate them, to collect them into an interiorized world, a world of the interior. Yet their significance precisely resists this domestication and a symbolic reading that this would entail. They are eccentric to the analytical scene, while at the same time constituting that scene. Reinhard writes, "Thus, the non-specular fascination of Freud's antiquities is a function neither of what they look like, their imaginary similitudes, nor what they represent, their symbolic interpretations, but their constitution as signifier things in a collection. Like signifiers, that is, they promise a legibility which they deny. Like things, they opaquely, mutely point only to themselves. It is useful at this point to recall Benjamin's account of the collection, which was considered as an attempt to reconstruct the alienated individual within the interior through the wresting of objects from their circulation as commodities. Yet the collection could never simply remember the subject, as it veered between completeness and openness. The interior, instantiated as a container of privacy, subjectified the collection, giving rise to this instability. In this psychoanalytic context, collecting can thus be cast as the drive to seek out the complex mix of object and experience, a Proustian Madeleine, if you will, that might allow the collector to take hold of their experience, an experience that would not simply be the subject's conscious personal history, rather one that was registered below the level of consciousness as the trauma that left its mark on the subject. The collection might, in its failure to find that object forever lost, take on this consequence of becoming the subject's personal history, and as such, act as a kind of compensation for the subject alienated from themselves. Yet this compensation is a false one, the collapsing of the extimate memory trace into the remembrance which Benjamin recognised through Freud and Theodor Reich as destructive. Ultimately, the subject becomes possessed by the collection. The interior which encases the collection encases the subject also. Let us return to the photographs that provided the opening to pursue this argument. Rather than consider how they provide the truth of this interpretation, let us apply this argument to the photographs themselves. Rather than considering them as transparent windows onto the reality of a spatial condition, let us consider the very materiality of the photographs. That is, to consider them outside a frame of representation. The analytic scene is thus no more than a collection of photographs which double a scene which is itself forever lost. Jacques Lacan recalled seeing what he called the remains of Freud's collection in the house Freud occupied for a short time while in London before his death. In this London arrangement, the complex optics and acoustics of Vienna could not be retained. Now, what is at stake here is not a lost fidelity between photographs, objects, and their spatial arrangements. The preceding analysis of the archaeological metaphor, I hope, has done much to displace such a consideration. Rather, these photographs and the way they relate to Freud's practice and the theorizations that arose from and directed this practice raise crucial questions concerning how photography is understood as evidencing the interior. A sense of doubleness between image and space occurs through their displacement from one another. Currently, at the site of Freud's consulting rooms in Vienna, Engelmann's photographs are positioned on the walls of the largely empty, though still cramped, consulting rooms. This collection of photographs has returned to the inside space to offer an image of the absent interior. Or put the other way, Freud's interior has returned to this space as a collection of photographs. Rather than a transparent boundary between representation and space, there is an uncanny doubling, a sense of discrepancy, a gap which produces the most palpable of doubled interiors. The photographs do not mediate this discrepancy, rather their material presence in the interior produces it. They show precisely the absence of the things they picture, but also the uncanny anamorphic reappearance of the interior. They manifest as flat objects hung on walls, walls they themselves have interiorized, but which in no clear way do they represent. This sense of the interior uncanny, which I would want to distinguish from the architectural uncanny, offers a way of understanding the idea of a spatial construction of the subject, and why the interior is intimately bound up with identification and with recognition. In a footnote to his essay on the uncanny, Freud mentions several anecdotes, two from Ernst Mach and one of his own, that describe coming across one's double. Freud's anecdote describes how, while on a train trip, the washroom door between his compartment and the one next to his swung open, and another traveller appeared to be entering into Freud's cabin from the washroom. Thinking that this person had simply exited the washroom in the wrong direction, into Freud's cabin instead of his own on the other side, Freud jumped up to set the man straight, only to realise that he was looking at his own reflection in the mirror on the open washroom door. He writes, "I can still recollect that I thoroughly disliked his, that is Freud's reflection's appearance. Instead, therefore, of being frightened by our doubles, both Mark and I simply failed to recognise them as such. Is it not possible, though, that our dislike of them was a vestigial trace of the archaic reaction which feels the double to be something uncanny?" This situation can be related to Lacan's own description of the mirror stage as the situation where the child identifies with an image of its body presented in a mirror. Triggered by the double in the mirror, this identification produces an ego always alienated from itself. Elizabeth Gross has called this an image of an imaginary anatomy, which reflects social and familial beliefs about the body more than it does the body's own organic nature. She has also emphasised the way in which the mirror image also duplicates the environment, placing real and virtual space in contiguous relations. And she emphasises in Lacan the crucial role the body image plays in the subject's capacity to locate itself and its objects in space. Space is not a pre-existing container into which a body projects itself. Rather, it is formed around the reflection of an imaginary anatomy. In his train cabin, Freud was only able to locate himself spatially when he recognised his own imaginary anatomy. As Gross argues, the representation of space is thus a correlate of one's ability to locate oneself as the point of origin or reference of space. The space represented is a complement of the kind of subject who occupies it. Lacan himself writes, "The mirror stage is a drama whose internal thrust is precipitated from insufficiency to anticipation, and which manufactures for the subject, caught up in the lure of spatial identification, the succession of fantasies that extends from a fragmented body image to a form of its totality, which I shall call orthopedic, and lastly, the assumption of the armour of an alienating identity, which will mark with its rigid structure the subject's entire mental development." While there would be a link to be developed between the scene of the mirror stage and the normalising role of the family, the social and familial beliefs which surround the body, I should conclude by returning to the problematic of experience that Benjamin expressed relative to the interior's emergence. The interior became consolidated in bourgeois life at the moment when the possibility of grasping experience in its long form was becoming ever more elusive. For Benjamin, the classic example of this attempt to take hold of experience was to be found in Proust. In thinking about his childhood in Cambrai, Proust was concerned with how memories are revived. His experience of tasting tea in which a madeleine had been dipped produced a cascade of visual memories, arising, as Proust writes, like stage sets that augmented spatially and topographically his initial voluntary recollections of his childhood. Proust writes, "Immediately the old grey house upon the street, where Aunt Leonie's room was, rose up like a stage set to attach itself to the little pavilion opening onto the garden, which had been built out behind it for my parents, the isolated segment which, until that moment, had been all that I could see. And so Proust's memories augment themselves into the imagistic stage set, the interior, within which the recollections of his life play out. What are Proust's memories if not his own production of images that operate as interiors in the imagistic sense? Of his experience of memory, Proust writes, "Seek more than that, create. The mind is face to face with something which does not yet exist, which it alone can make actual, which it alone can bring into the light of day." Compare this moment to Freud's recognition of the presence in his train carriage of his reflection, a presence initially felt bodily and cannily. Recognition of the type Freud and Proust wrote about remembers and spatially positions the subject, though, for Lacan, the interiorized scene of the mirror stage produces the alienation that constitutes identification as a continual process. Thus, remembering can only be articulated and can only carry its subjectifying force to the extent that an uncanny gap, a gap between sensation and its source, or a slippage between image and space, is felt palpably as the uncanny. This is the psychological context for the emergence of the interior. Now, what I think I have attempted to do in this lecture is to understand the doubleness of the interior outside of a framework that would try to naturalise or smooth over the effects of this doubleness. One arrives at doubleness not as a kind of expression of the interior's essence, but precisely as its problematisation. The interior as image exists not as its representation, even though conventionally this is the way one might consider photographs. Rather, the image is the problematisation of representation. The space of the interior is not simply a pre-existent container, but a formation intimately tied up with a subjectifying activity. The relationship between image and space is thus one of a problematic twinning, out of which the interior is produced. While in this lecture I have been concerned with particular accounts of the interior and of experience and subjectivity which have been linked to these, there is room to conceive of the interior with wholly different concepts of the image and of spacing. The key, though, is to consider that while the current and pervasive conceptualization of the interior had particular historical conditions of emergence, how this point of emergence is considered relative to new concepts and instances of the image and of spacing and structuring is an area calling for new and critical thinking. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Any questions?
I could put it a few ways. I think what fascinates me about the interior is our fascination with it. Why is it such a fascinating, consuming context in contemporary life? Why is life, social relations structured around domesticity and the interior so closely? So that's one question. That leads to the question of how experience relates to that. I think currently our experience of domesticity is one of its mediation. that it comes to us via images. We're very at ease then with looking at images, whether they be television images, magazine images, etc., and relating them to sort of our spatial existence. So there is something at stake that is kind of normalized in contemporary culture, and I would argue has been for kind of from this point in the 19th century, about this relation between images of domestic life and their kind of spatial revisions, the kind of things one creates spatially to produce that domesticity. So what I'm looking for is a kind of way of understanding, and I'm consciously wanting to do this in a theoretical vein. How do we make sense of that? What tools of thinking, concepts, can we have to not simply be subsumed or live an existence within that normal understanding, but to understand how it might have come about, and then to be able to think about its manipulability, its manipulation. So I'm particularly interested in the way that images are not simply transparent windows onto spatial conditions. There is something about how we recognize them, though, and that process of recognition is not about simply seeing things as they are, but about kind of making sense of them and revising them spatially. And I guess the path I've followed, though there would be other paths that one might follow, is through a kind of psychoanalytical account of what that means. So I guess I'm consciously trying to work through the theory that we might have to understand this, because I don't think that exists currently. One thing I'm trying to push away is this easy consumability of images, which seems to structure the history of the interior and the contemporary account of the interior. So I'm conscious to really try and do something very different from that.
It seems to me also, just sort of following on from that the sort of critique you're attempting to make of the use of photographs and other images as forms of evidence, I mean, that has implications for historians, for critics, but it also seems to me that it could potentially have sort of implications for people who produce these images in the first place. And I'm not sure exactly sort of what the practical impact would be, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Not directly, because I think there's some value in, let's say, taking a critical position towards practices that might, in fact, produce a kind of bewilderment about things that are so normal and so kind of ingrained in, let's say, life. So in some ways, I think it's about breaking tendencies and conventional understandings of the way images work. Now, whether that has a kind of operative dimension to it for the practices of producing images in spaces, I'm not sure, and it's not really something I wish to sort of speculate on, really. But I think there is something to say about having an account of the domestic that is, and if this is not a kind of contradictory, a kind of non- or anti-humanist account of the domestic. How is it that in fact, what has happened since the emergence of the interior, if I could sort of make this sort of bold claim, is a process of normalisation. We've become normalised to a domestic life, rather than that being what has accompanied us kind of throughout time, as it were. And so that's the kind of large bomb I'm kind of lobbing somewhere into the field. I mean, I think, architects, designers will sort of make of it what they will, and that might itself be an interesting process, but I'm not necessarily one to speculate about what the operative dimension of it would be.
I'm curious if you're also fascinated about domesticity nowadays, and whether you would write something about not emergence of interiority, but decrease or disappearance of interiority because of the time we spend at home and screens, that in a sense the screen, more and more the computer is our interiority. That's the place where we store, where we collect is in that box, and that we're fixed to the screen, not to the domesticity around the fire, around the table, that it's disappearing.
I mean, I think it's an extremely interesting area, and it is something that I think I want to think about, and some other people have done very interesting work in this area. I mean, one thing that particularly interested me regarding kind of my theory of the interior, its double nature, its image nature and its spatial nature, is in fact how the two interact in the way in which showing an image in a context even such as this lecture hall produces a kind of interiority orientated towards that image. And so there is a way in which it becomes something like a reanalysis of spectatorship or something. What produces this kind of grouping such that we're all attending to this sort of image? The way in which a kind of interiority is produced around, the computer screen, no matter what space one would happen to be in. I think the sort of forms of technology and image making and their ability to construct interiors, within the home, outside the home, actually is not, that in the home, outside, interior, exterior is perhaps no longer the important question, but it's about the production of interiorities through forms of mediation and technology. And I think that's a really, really important question.
Thanks for the talk. It's great. You've mentioned the Lacanian way and research that you've been into the psychoanalysis. That's very interesting. I just wish to like to know, is there, apart from the double images that you talked about, the mirroring, and did you sort of further your study into the maybe the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary status of human beings, and maybe towards fullness?
Yeah.
Maybe not only the mirror image, but maybe towards metaphorically or tonically, maybe towards can we build more fullness like the human being?
I mean, I'm not so much interested in, how can this be made sort of better or more full. I have to say my kind of interest in the psychoanalytical came out of Benjamin and the way there was a kind of a spark, as it were, in his account of experience, which caused me, as it were, to move into this sort of area. I don't claim the kind of an overall account of that. It's a very partial one based on a particular direction I took out of Benjamin. So it's a pathway, and as I say, there would be other accounts to be given. What I would hold fairly strongly to, though, is this idea of the sort of historical emergence, that there is a kind of a way in which a modern concept of the interior can be established with particular effects in particular conditions of possibility around the early 19th century that hadn't previously existed. Now, what you make of that emergence and the pathways one might have for theorising that and doing work around that, this is one, and there would be others to be had.
Sorry. Yeah.
So, if this emergence, can it bring us towards to the structural sides of it?
This what side of it?
The post-linguistic side of it. Do you have to
I'm not sure, but there's a project out there for you.
I mean, maybe you partly said it, but like in respect to the doubling of the kind of interior kind of image, how does that for you kind of in general relate to the exteriority of the city? If you see what I mean. I mean, when you've kind of dealt with doubleness, there's this reference, where clearly in a sense at the same time that a mystic interior has a kind of definite kind of diagrammatic relation with the urban.
Yeah. I think the key thing for me is that, I make the point that the interior is separable from the inside space of architecture, and that's the point of its emergence, is that kind of conceptual leap, if you like. I think what that opens up is that the inside space of architecture is a kind of a one contingent location where interiors might be made, which then says, well, there would be other, as it were, contingent locations. All through Benjamin's account, through the Arcades project, you know, he's very interested in the idea, the figures he traces, such as the flaneur. The flaneur makes interiors in the city, in certain modes of perception, becomes an interior. So it is about this separability from architecture that means that the interior-exterior divide is no longer a kind of hard, fast type thing. And also with all of the conditions of experience of modernity that are urban conditions, I think that's kind of carries the force of that separation.
Hello? Sorry, could you speak up?
Yeah. How do you posit the body of women into this idea of the collectible? Obviously, that looking at 19th-century interiors, there's that relationship with hysteria and the sense that women became part of the material.
I mean, the first thing I'd say is that it's I've been.
Hang on, just let's all wait for it. I mean, they did it once. I do hope someone can turn it off.
The Benjaminian account, which I guess one of the things I've been doing or have done in this lecture is follow the logic of that, which is clearly an account of the male subject and the kind of experience organised around this kind of male subjectivity. I mean, it's actually not explicit; it's just simply embedded in the material. So I guess one of my task has been to follow that and to try and recognise that, but also to then say that, of course, you know, with the idea of normalisation and the familial and the laying out of gendered roles it's precisely the 19th century, it's precisely the context of the interior that allows those roles, as it were, to be assigned, and for the very destabilisation to take place in those roles. And, you know, reading Freud and his difficulty, as it were, in coping with both the normalising function of psychoanalysis in organising subjectivities and the fact that what he's dealing with are the breakdowns in that. Okay, that at every moment there is a kind of a breakdown in the normal gendered role. So, of course, you know, there's no way in which gender is not a subject. I guess my specific take on it was the way in which the Benjaminian account is quite specifically gendered male.